In our last episode, we talked about how the whole Bible is about Jesus. But if you're barely believing, some of you may be asking the question, all right, that's fine. The whole Bible's about Jesus, but was he actually real? Did he even really exist? You've heard somewhere maybe some skeptic or some scholar said, no, it's all a myth. It's all made up. Stay tuned to this episode of the Barely Believing podcast because we are going to be looking at this topic. Was Jesus real? Hello once again. My name is Pastor Dustin Hall, and it is a privilege and a thrill to be here with you on the Barely Believing podcast. As always, in every episode, we have to say, like, share, subscribe. It's the lifeblood of our podcast. It's so needed for a few reasons. When you subscribe or like our podcast on YouTube, on Spotify, you won't miss any of the content. So it's a help to you. But also when you do these things, it helps our podcast grow because it tells the algorithms, hey, this is something interesting that people are interested in. So when you engage with any of our content, it helps our podcast to grow. And so we are on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, we are on YouTube. You can catch us in those places. And also when you see a post on Facebook, comment, like, share, subscribe, leave a question. If you don't like something I said, argue with me. All that engagement is good for the podcast. It's all good. And so please just make sure you're engaging with our content. The other thing is you can ask questions. You can leave comments. You can go to our website, barelypod.com. We're going to be having some in-person events coming up, and you can find out when those things and where they're happening, and where they're happening. You'll be able to find a contact us button where you can ask those questions, and we're going to have upcoming episodes from your questions. This is about building a family. This is about building a community, and these are the early episodes, so you're getting in on the ground floor. So please engage with us. Like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, and we know that this podcast is going to be a blessing. So far, it's just been me on these episodes, but this time I have a friend here with me, and I'm going to bring him in right now. Pastor Mark Granados. How you doing?
Doing well. It is an honor to be here. It is a privilege. I get to work alongside our senior pastor, and it is a privilege being part of one of the early episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. So nice to be here with you, and I know you've got a lot to share, and you'll be on many episodes, hearing your stories. We'll be engaging together, but I wanted to bring you in on this one because it's good to have a conversation about this, and this is going to be one where we talk a little bit about history. A lot of facts about individuals that lived. And so rather than just listening to me talk about all these people, I thought, let's bring in somebody else and we can have a little bit of back and forth. And that's what we're going to be doing frequently here on the podcast. It's not just going to be me every time. We're going to have conversations with people in our community, people that have been on the same journey of faith that you might be on. And so excited to have this family, this barely believing family grow. So I'm going to bring up here on the screen something really what I find interesting, Jesus versus Alexander the Great. Jesus versus Alexander the Great, to my knowledge, historically, they never got in a fight or anything like that. But they did face off historically in a different way, or they do face off historically in a different way. Well, what do I mean by that? So people ask the question, or people have asked the question, did Jesus really exist? Was he a real person? And sometimes you'll hear these scholars on the History Channel and other places come up with all these reasons why he didn't exist. But if you apply the same rules of determining his existence to other historical figures, like Alexander the Great, we actually find something really interesting. And you were sharing with me something earlier about how we even know that he existed. Yeah. Can you share with me a little bit about what maybe you were saying there earlier?
So the question, whether or not Jesus existed, it's an interesting question because I get to look back on comparing the same principles of someone who's a historical figure like Alexander the Great. We have maybe 4 to 9 manuscripts that just describe that he existed, that we acknowledge that he is real. But when it comes to Jesus, I believe we're in the thousands of manuscripts that proves his existence.
Yeah, so what we have with Alexander is we have the city of Alexandria. We have some statues, some legend. But what most people don't know is that all we know about him, his personality, his intentions, even his, what's the word, his fame or his reputation, his resume, was only written 300 or 400 years after he actually lived.
Incredible.
So when it comes to Jesus, and we're going to see this a little bit in a little bit here, there are, within just 10 or so years of his life, eyewitness accounts of what he did. So with Alexander, it's hundreds of years later, written about who he was and what his intentions were and, you know, what he believed in and his exploits, hundreds of years later. But we don't question his existence. We don't question whether or not he actually lived. But with Jesus, because they don't want to believe who Jesus was or what Jesus taught, we find people calling into question who he was and whether he really existed. So, interesting. And so what I wanted to do here now is actually look at some other historical figures and apply the same principles or concepts to their existence that we apply to Jesus and say, well, did they really live or did they not really live? So let's look at this a little bit here. So this is the city of Alexandria. So this is talking about Alexander again. It says the city of Alexandria and other artifacts confirm that around 300 BC, there was a man named Alexander who had enormous power. But the only record of who he was and what he actually did, the myth of him, was written 300 or 400 years later.
Incredible.
So if you were thinking about, if you were in a court of law and an eyewitness didn't actually see it, and it was something that had been told to them hundreds of years through generations, how reliable would you believe that to be?
Not very reliable at all.
So with Jesus, it's much different, as we've been saying. So let's look at these other historical figures. So Homer, one of Homer's works is actually going to be put into a movie soon, the Iliad. They're making the Iliad, or no, the Odyssey. It's the Odyssey. And I read that in high school. Did you read?
Never got to read
high school. I liked the Odyssey better than the Iliad. The Iliad's more straight history, and the Odyssey is more mythology and fantasy and that sort of thing. So it was a little more interesting. And I was known as the kid who could interpret Homer in my senior class.
Really?
In high school, yeah. I don't know why. I was guessing most of the time. But for Homer, so Homer lived in the 8th century, and here's evidence. This is straight from historians. It is uncertain whether Homer was a real person or a composite tradition. In other words, a whole bunch of people that were all put together, their works, their thoughts, their works put together, like a compilation. So historians don't actually know the answer to that. And the Iliad and the Odyssey are centuries removed from the events they describe, same with Alexander. So they were written hundreds of years later. So we're back to that same dilemma, right?
Yeah.
There is no archaeology applied to him personally. And here's the thing. Homer, in the perception of a lot of people, there's no question whether or not Homer was a real person. But yet there's far less period historical evidence for his existence than Jesus. But people want to call Jesus' existence into question.
Yeah.
What do you think?
But the critique is not the same. It's not fair. It's biased.
If you use the same rules,
yeah,
and you're going to say Jesus doesn't exist, what about these other people? We don't doubt them. Why do you think they want to say that he didn't? What are your thoughts there?
Well, that's a tough question because it's oftentimes, I believe it may come from a place of in denial. I don't want to either I believe Jesus existed and the claims that he has said are real and true, or I can just put that aside and focus on a different historical figure, which I have very little resources that prove his existence, but many people in society has a general understanding of who they are.
Yeah, I think that denial part's big, because if Jesus existed, then that means I need to look at who I am. I need to look at what he wants for my life. If there's a creator, if there's a God, there's a chance that God has a certain way he wants me to live.
Yeah.
And so it's easier to deny it and just write it off than it is to actually believe it and consider it, right? So that's a big one. So Socrates, we've heard of Socrates, the great philosopher. Well, let's apply these rules of interpretation or belief to him. So Socrates lived somewhere 470 to 399. You may have heard of his story before. He was condemned to death and had to drink poison. I can't remember what the herb was that made him drink, but yeah, he drank it and committed suicide because he was under the death penalty, right? So it was Socrates. No writings of his own survive. None. And we only know him through Plato. Okay, so Plato was one of his disciples.
Yeah.
So we have Jesus's disciples writing about Jesus, and we deny Jesus' existence, but we have Plato, one of Socrates' disciples, and we say Socrates actually existed, right? So let's use the same measurements to talk about these two. There is no archaeology directly tied to Socrates. And so again, if we take this evidence for Socrates' existence, why not take Jesus? This evidence is Jesus' existence. So that's Socrates. You know anything about Socrates? You learn much about him?
If I remember correctly, he was one of our biggest philosophers that created intuitive thinking, deep, profound questions.
Highly influential.
Yes.
In really a lot of the pillars of society, especially Plato. Plato had a little bit more influence when it came to society, but he got his ideologies from Socrates, who was his teacher. So again, we say Jesus doesn't exist, but Socrates did.
We should have the same standard for both.
Let's use the same standard. King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, right? So King Arthur was in the 5th and 6th century AD, mentioned in early medieval texts centuries later, and it's largely legendary. So it's these big, if you've ever read anything about King Arthur, there's magic involved and there's all sorts of things. No archaeology to prove his existence, but most people just accept that King Arthur was a real guy and he really had the Knights of the Round Table and everything like this. So people often assume he probably existed, yet the evidence for King Arthur is far weaker than evidence for Jesus.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
All right. So Cleopatra, you might be surprised. Cleopatra, we see evidence of her on contemporary coins, inscriptions, and accounts from Greek and Roman historians. Even the archaeology about Cleopatra, limited ruins, mostly linked to the Ptolemaic dynasty. So even though we have some artifacts, much of her life is reconstructed from secondary accounts, just like with Jesus, similar in method to early Christian sources. So again, we're doubting the existence of Jesus, but accepting the existence of Cleopatra.
Yeah.
So the point is, we have all of these real historical figures that there is the same type of evidence or less. We don't doubt them, but people do doubt the existence of Jesus again. So Confucius lived 551 to 479. Biographies were written decades or centuries later about him, and they were in some early disciples' writings exist, but no contemporary records, limited archaeology, mostly inferred from later texts. Again, no immediate contemporary documentation, and there is of Jesus, eyewitness accounts of Jesus. Now, this one's interesting. Even to this day, and a lot of people don't know this, but there is near universal scholarly consensus. Virtually all modern historians, and this might be a shock to some people, virtually all modern historians and New Testament scholars, including atheists and agnostics like Bart Ehrman, agree that Jesus existed as a historical figure.
Wow.
So if people are hearing from someone that he didn't exist and they've got all this evidence, they are in the very, very tiny minority. The idea that he was entirely mythical is considered a fringe view with no support in mainstream academia. So any honest historian believes that Jesus actually existed.
It's incredible.
You don't hear that, right? You don't hear that in a lot of circles. And again, it's because I think people are trying to avoid what the ramifications of his existence would actually be.
And it brings me to thought that to think about the things that we hold on so close to our hearts, our values, our morals. Oftentimes we get these things by word of mouth, but when we do our own research, such as the evidence of Jesus, are we just taking that for what traditions has to say, what mom or dad has to say, maybe grandma? Or do we explore these things in our life with faith, or do these things with ourselves?
Yeah, where are you getting your history? Getting it from the History Channel and their conspiracy theory shows? Or if your father was an atheist, are you just taking his word for it? Well, why not dig into these things, especially when it comes to Jesus, because the stakes are so high.
Yeah.
If he really existed and said he was God, you got to figure out for yourself who Jesus is, right?
Yeah. Either he's a liar or he says what he says he is.
He's a liar or he's crazy, or he's the devil. One of those, right? So everyone should have the responsibility of deciding for themselves who he is and not just taking the words of other people, especially the skeptics. You got to listen to everybody, and weigh that. So let's look at some other things here. So let's take you to, just making sure our audio is still going here. Okay, so we've got Confucius. Oh, did we talk about Confucius? No, we didn't talk about Confucius yet. Confucius, the Chinese philosopher, 551 to 479, somewhere in there. Biographies written, again, decades or centuries later. Early disciples' writings exist, but no contemporary records. Same thing with Jesus. And it wasn't, again, centuries later with Jesus. It was 10, 20 years after Jesus' life.
Decades.
Archaeology is very limited about Confucius, but mostly inferred from later texts. And it really applies because he really set the foundations for modern Chinese culture. And yet, there's somewhat limited evidence. Nobody doubts his existence, but again, they do with Jesus. All right, so let's look at some other things here, which is really important. So let me bring up let me bring this up here. So Josephus. So you've heard of Josephus before, Mark, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So there are some independent sources, all within 100 years of Jesus' life. There are at least 14 sources, Christian and non-Christian. And we're going to be looking at a couple here in just a second. Josephus and Tacitus. Tacitus, I should say. Pliny the Elder, I don't have his quotes, but he's another one that wrote of Jesus.
Yeah.
They all mention Jesus within a century of his death, and these were not his followers. These were Jews. They were others. Romans, Pliny and Tacitus were Romans, Roman guards, Roman soldiers. More for the other first century Galilean figures. This includes the New Testament Gospels, which historians treat as source material. True historians treat the Gospels as source material.
Yeah.
It's not just fairy tales. They treat it as source material.
Not just parables, no myths,
It's eyewitnesses, right? And independent non-Christian references. So let's look at a couple of those right now. So this is Josephus. Now, Josephus, do you know much about Josephus? You know anything about him?
If I remember correctly, he was an ancient Jewish historian.
Yep, ancient Jewish historian. He was in the military to some capacity, had some influence there. A Jew, not a follower of Jesus. There's one quote that's often attributed to Josephus, and I thought it was interesting to bring up. So some people say Josephus wrote this, and we have his writings. We can read his original writings, right? So at this time, this is what it says. People have said Josephus wrote. At this time, there was Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man.
Wow.
For he was a doer of wonderful works. He was the Christ. He appeared to them alive again on the third day. Those come from Josephus's writings. Now, it's a little bit problematic because skeptics want to say maybe Josephus didn't write that. So we can't confirm that. If he did write that, he was saying he rose again from the dead. He may have been the Christ, not a follower of Jesus. So let's take the debatable one out, and let's find the one that did, in fact, everybody confirms that Josephus actually did write. What he probably wrote at this time, or what he definitely wrote, at this time there was Jesus, a wise man. He performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. When Pilate, at the accusation of the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, so there's a reference to the crucifixion, those who had first loved him did not cease. So his disciples followed him even after his crucifixion. This is Josephus. And the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day.
Wow. How long did he live after Jesus? I believe 100 years after that?
Yeah, so Josephus, let me look at that statistic again. So he lived 37 AD to 100 AD. So he was a contemporary with the Apostle Paul, with John, with the disciples. And so 37 AD would have been,
About
10 years or so, 10 years after Jesus was crucified, right?
Yeah.
So this is a guy who's talking to eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus. There's no question.
Yeah.
And apparently the Christian movement was significant enough that Josephus, a Jewish historian, thought he needed to write about it.
Yeah.
Because there was a movement of Christians he's talking about. So what? Yeah.
And it helps me confirm some of the arguments I've heard over time where people, so if they finally get Jesus as they accept that he existed. Now the next step is they deny him crucified. Some people says that they got the narrative wrong, but here we have an ancient historian just confirming two things, that there is a person by the name of Jesus and who was crucified.
And then, of course, the other big denial is he didn't rise from the dead. Maybe he was crucified, but he didn't rise from the dead. We'll talk about that one here in just a second. We'll have another episode on did Jesus really rise from the dead? But there's some other things, some interesting things we're going to share here today too. So Tacitus, a Roman senator and governor, and he wrote this in 116 AD, so not that long after the life of Jesus, 80 years or so. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. So what that's referring to is actually Nero was a horrible persecutor of Christians. He fed them to lions in the Colosseum. He just slaughtered them. He thought they were, this major nuisance, and everything wrong with the Roman Empire was because of the Christians. He even blamed them for burning Rome.
Yeah.
Right. So Tacitus is bringing this up, and he's referring to Nero's hatred of the Christians. Christus, whom from the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, the extreme penalty, there's a crucifixion again, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of his procurators, Pontius Pilate.
Wow.
And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the source of the evil, he's talking about the Christian church, the rise of the Christian church, but even in Rome. So talking about the death, Jesus existing, his death, and the rise of Christianity as a result of the life and death of Jesus. Yeah. This is a Roman governor, senator and governor. So people don't know about these sources. They don't know that this actually exists, but it's historical record. It's right there. No one questions it. It's all there. So the other part is we have early Christian writings close to the events. We have the New Testament, the authentic letters of Paul, written in 48 to 62 AD, only 15 to 30 years after Jesus' death. And, what do we know how about the Apostle Paul started? He started off as Saul. Yeah. And what was Saul like? Tell us.
Oh, man. Saul, this guy was a person filled with passion. He was zealous, so to speak. Zealous is this huge desire to do right by your faith, by your God. And this was a person who was the Pharisee, the Jewish of the Jews, who had all the credentials, studied under one of the famous rabbis at his time. And he was persecuting Christians because he believed that this Christian group, these followers of Christ, were like a virus, infecting and indoctrinating, twisting the true words of God.
Yeah. And so, as the Bible tells us, he had this major conversion. He had this vision of Jesus, and everything changed. He realized that what he'd been doing was wrong. The Christians were right. And he viewed Judaism completely differently. So the fact that we have, and we know Paul existed. He was a real person. We know that he was a Pharisee who was of the Jewish religion, not a Christian, and he had this massive life transformation. How do you explain that? He would have lost everything to become a Christian. The Pharisees were wealthy. The Pharisees were in high regard. They had basically everything you could ever want in the Jewish culture at the time. Respect, money, honor. And he would have been throwing it all away to follow Jesus. It doesn't make a lot of sense unless he actually saw what he says he saw, right?
Yeah.
So Paul mentions Jesus as a real person who was crucified, had a brother named James, whom Paul personally met, was born of a woman, had earthly teachings, and there are those among the earliest surviving Christian documents and show a movement rising around a recent historical figure, just like Tacitus. So you have Paul, who was a Christian, confirming the same thing that Tacitus, a Roman senator, was saying.
Yeah.
So the evidence is piling up here, right?
Yeah. We've already surpassed the threshold that we have for other historical figures.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So I did want to have a small segue.
Yeah.
I did want to ask, if I'm a person who's barely believing, let alone I don't know if I can trust the Bible or not, how would I go about maybe looking up the sources? How do I know there's so much things on the internet? I've read that God made Adam and a person who, I'm forgetting her name, but it's the first Eve. And apparently God made a mistake, and therefore Eve was
these extra writings that
how
you're
do I
referring
know
to
verify them? What's the truth? What's not the truth?
Well, I think the first thing to do is, if we're, like we've been saying with these other historians, if we're going to take their word that they existed, or the words of others that they existed, and take their writings like the Iliad and the Odyssey as fact or close to fact, let's use the same methods to determine truth or history for them as we take for Jesus. So if even atheists take the Gospels as source material, read the Gospels as source material. Right? Whether you right away believe all of the things that are in the Gospels, that's up to you. But even if atheists are reading the Gospels as source material, start there. So with Paul, right? Start there. Test it. Try to talk to God. God, are you there? If you are, tell me if this is real. Show me what's real. Show me what I can trust in. So there has to come a point where you don't look at the Bible just as a book of fairy tales and myths. You look at it as, at least to some degree, true history.
That's right.
And then what you find is the longer you read the Bible and the longer you study the Bible, it starts to transform you. Especially when you read it in the context of this whole thing, Old Testament and New Testament is about one person, Jesus, and that Jesus teaches us about God's faithfulness to the human race. If you read it with that mindset, everything changes. So I guess to answer your question, again, it would be, take it as true history. Read it like it's a real book with real events. And even if you can't get down with the, Jonah and the whale story, read the Gospels as source material. Jesus really lived. That's what we're trying to get at. Jesus really lived. By every historical standard that we use for all these other people that existed in history, apply it to Jesus. And the Gospels are meant to be source material. So start there. I guess that's the way I would answer that question. So there's something else that people that debate such things talk about with the New Testament. It's called the criterion of embarrassment. So let's describe what that is. Early Christians would not likely invent embarrassing details like Jesus being baptized by John. John was an outcast. He was a nobody. Why would the King of Kings and Lord of Lords be baptized by an outcast and a nobody?
Yeah.
Right? A prostitute washing his feet with her hair. You know, all these real life stories of the disciples. Like these disciples are establishing a church, but you see them make mistakes. You see them struggle. You see them fail. Women were highly influential in the rise of the Christian church. If it was a lie and they were making it up, why would you include them to such a degree in that culture? Because it was such a patriarchal culture.
That's right.
So it's the criterion of embarrassment, or just there's elements in the New Testament that you wouldn't put there unless you're actually writing history.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So, and to the biggest thing, the crucifixion of Jesus, he hung naked on the most shameful and excruciating torture device ever devised by man at that point. And this is your king? This is your savior? Right? Yeah. Or it really happened. And they're writing it because it really happened. Yeah. These difficult elements are better explained as historical facts that the movement had to explain rather than fabricate. They were telling the story rather than just making something up. You don't make your hero die in shame. If he's going to die, you make him die with honor, not with shame. And actually the Jews, who the disciples were largely, they did not even believe the Messiah would die at all or would die young.
Yeah, a twisted view of it.
Well, they believed that he was going to kind of live forever, right? Yeah. They believed that he was going to be the king, that he was going to
overthrow Rome.
Exactly. Yeah. And so to die at all, and he's your Messiah, he's your king.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. Like so many of these elements make no sense when you know who's writing it and why they would be writing it, unless it's actually true.
Yeah.
Right? So this is the one that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on as we start to draw this to a close. But the fact that Christianity exists at all, to me, is proof that Jesus really lived and the Bible story is actually true. Let's think about this. So you think about the way that Christians, the deaths they died. You know, Peter hung upside down, crucified upside down. John boiled in oil, right? He survived it, but John boiled in oil. You know, we have some of them being drawn and quartered behind horses.
I believe the beheading of Paul.
Yeah, Bartholomew supposedly was skinned alive.
Yeah.
Right? So, and this is in history, right? I mean, these guys in history, this happened, according to historians. If it's a lie, why are you going to go through with all of that?
Yeah.
Right. None of these disciples, none of these guys ever said, you know what? I was just kidding.
Yeah.
You know, this is all a lie. None of them recanted. None of them retracted. They courageously and faithfully went to their death believing this, that Jesus rose. They did it because they saw something.
This brings me back to a funny skit. I think maybe this might have been through the skit guys, where all the disciples are gathered together and they're talking about, wow, Jesus just died. All right, guys, so let's fake that he's resurrected.
Yeah.
And everyone's cheering, oh, let's do it. And then once we fake his resurrection, we will be persecuted. And everyone's cheering, yeah, let's do it. And so on and so forth. But it doesn't make sense. And so there's one disciple, maybe it was Thomas, doubting, okay, but why are we going to do this if we're going to all end up persecuted or end up dying in a horrible way?
Yeah.
And he said, that's the point. And the video ends there.
Yeah.
So there's literally no point in why fabricating this whole thing so I could live a more miserable life in a secular sense.
Right. It'd be outcast, be judged, be persecuted. Why would you?
Yeah.
So the very fact that the church exists at all, if Jesus didn't really live, why do we have a Christian church?
Yeah.
Why do we have, and on top of that, okay, so Jesus really did live, but he was crucified, as all these other sources are telling us. And if he didn't rise, why would there be a Christian church today? The movement would have died. And that's what a lot of people don't know, is there were a lot of these so-called Messiah figures at that time. Barabbas in the Gospels was one of these guys who was going to rise up and conquer Rome in his mind. And he was, of course, conquered and wasn't able to go through with it.
Yep.
But after these people were either arrested or killed, their movements died. They died off. People didn't continue to follow them. Why is it different with Jesus? Why would it be different with Jesus? So we have extra biblical accounts of his existence. We have non-Christians testifying that he lived and that he was crucified.
Yeah.
And you have a church and you have disciples who died excruciating deaths and faced horrible persecution. And the church exists today. When you put those three things together, it's compelling.
Yeah.
It's compelling evidence that Jesus lived. It's really amazing. So the rapid rise of a movement, Christianity spread quickly among Jews in the 30s through the 60s AD, centered on a recently executed man as Messiah. Explaining this without a real founding figure requires complex speculation about pure myth and invention, which historians find less plausible than a historical Jesus whose life inspired the stories.
Who's saying these?
So historians, even non-Christians,
Wow.
are saying if there was really no Jesus and his entire life was made up, why do we have Christianity?
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make any sense. So these are not even necessarily Christians. They're just looking at this and going, to make this whole thing up is extremely unlikely.
Yeah.
And the fact that the church still exists today is further evidence that Jesus really lived, Jesus was really crucified, and they saw something significant enough to make them take that belief that he rose again to their grave.
Imagine if you were the disciples at that time. It is so much easier for me to sit down and someone's threatening my life and I can do a simple lie. Okay, I don't really believe Jesus existed. I can throw that away. But to stand firm on a truth, saying, no, I literally saw Jesus resurrected and I'm willing to die on that. That takes guts, courage, and it goes against our very nature of survival.
Right, right, yeah. So before we close, I want to ask you this question. So new on the podcast.
That's right.
Trying to get to know you on the podcast.
Yeah.
Why do you believe Jesus is real?
You know, when you've asked me that question earlier, one thing came to mind, and there's two answers to this. There's the personal experience answer. That one is a little bit more sensitive in my case because I didn't grow up Adventist. I grew up with a Christian background, but I really never was a practicing Christian. I wasn't a biblical Christian. And at the age of 13, 14, I come across this community, this church, and during this time, I grew up in a single family home. So I'm here trying to understand, with my Christian background, what's the meaning of love, of the meaning of life? Why am I here? I've struggled with things like depression and identity and purpose. And at the age of 13, I found this community, this Christian community that took me in. But at the same time, this was one of the hardest parts in my life. My parents, who was the only parent at the time, my mom, she was both my mom and dad, and we had this amazing connection for so many years. But for some reason, as soon as I started getting closer and building this relationship with God, my mom and I we started arguing. There's arguments. We said things to each other that was so hurtful. We're like, I hate you, Mom. And my mom said, I hate you, son.
Wow.
Of course, in Spanish. And it felt like my world was falling apart. And this went on not for a couple of days. It went on for weeks, maybe even months. And I shared this with a pastor. And he knew me from the community. And we played basketball together. And he invited me to be more involved in church. And I thought when I shared these things with him, he was going to hit me with Bible verses. Oh, this is what God says. But instead, he just listened. And he says, hey, mind if I drop you off at home today? It's like, yeah, of course. He drops me off home. He's like, mind if I talk to your mom? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. He talks with my mom, and he speaks to her. He prays with her. And then he comes to me. He speaks to me and prays with me. And all three of us all pray together. Now, prayer wasn't new in my life, but I never really took it seriously. But since that moment where God was invited in that house, my mother and I never had an argument that ever went that bad. And that,
So transformation.
yes,
Yeah.
that personal experience, that answered prayer was somehow, might seem insignificant to a lot of people, was so significant to me. We're like, God is real. He is real. Of course, I later grow on to go to school and start thinking for myself and all that good stuff. And so I have to ask myself, what is the evidence of this Jesus person that I'm following? And the evidence just keeps piling up, as you have said.
Yeah. I think for me, there's been a few times in my life, and maybe we'll have more episodes so I can share more of these stories, but there's been a few times in my life where God has just shown up.
Yeah.
When I was a little kid, there was a really scary thing that was going on. My mom was taken to the doctor, and the doctor had to explain to me what was going on with her health, and it was a really scary moment. And all of a sudden, I just felt a hand on my shoulder.
Wow.
And I heard, not like an audible voice, but I heard speaking in my heart, if you can say it that way. And then God was just saying, it's going to be okay.
Wow.
I was like 6 or 8 years old, right? So that was one time. Another time, I was actually in a baseball game. I was playing baseball, and God showed up, and I'll share that story another time. But there was another time where I was going through a really difficult time, high stress, dealing with my own mental health issues, and I couldn't sleep. I was having a terrible time sleeping.
Yeah.
And I was praying, God, where are you? Why am I going through this? Why are you allowing this to happen? Struggling.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I just said, Lord, if you're not going to let me sleep, and I put out my hand. I said, even if I can't sleep, I just need to know that you're near, and I need you to take my hand.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, I felt his hand in mine. So God showed up. And there's been a lot of other times in my life where I knew it was real. And it's one thing to know God exists, but as I study the Bible, that same God that I know that took my hand is Jesus.
That's right.
Like the Bible explains to me that it's him. That's the one who it was. And it makes sense because the comfort, the joy, the healing I needed from the God who took my hand, I see perfectly exemplified in the person of Jesus. Right. So that's been in my life. And like you say, transformation, change, learning, just all of a sudden you're reading the Bible or you're praying, and all of a sudden just this light hits you, and you're like, wow. And you feel God's presence, you feel Jesus's presence. So it's a lot of ways, truth in his word, how trustworthy Bible prophecy is, just like all these things. So there's numerous ways,
and I noticed a phrase you kept on repeating, God showed up. We read about it in the Bible and as a historical evidence, and we see it in outside of the Bible evidences of how there was this Jesus person, how he's real, and how he worked in the lives of others, created a movement, and how he still does that today. It's incredible.
Yeah. So if somebody was asking you, is God real in my life? Like, how do I know? How can I have that same kind of experience that you've had? What would you tell them?
It's incredible. I'd say not everyone's experience is your experience. I once thought that I had to go down to the depths of drug abuse and alcohol abuse in order to experience God. But God met me at my door in my broken home.
Yeah.
I'd say for someone who's searching to seek God is ask him that same question. I don't know if you're real. I don't know who you are, what's your name, and whether or not I'm even talking to myself in this room. But Lord, if you are real, and be honest with yourself, be willing to be wrong. Because if I've had a notion of unbelief that there is no such thing as a God, but this is the one moment I allow myself to experience him, he will answer that.
Yeah, I think that's good because be willing to be wrong, or said a different way. Maybe it's a lot of people, I don't want to say a lot of people, I'm going to say everybody. At times in their life have asked the question, God, is that you? Is that God? And I'm going to say, yes, it is. I think some people know and they stuff it because they don't They think that God's going to come into their life, Jesus is going to come into their life, and all of a sudden it's going to be, they got to give up everything fun and enjoyable. They got to give up their identity and who they are.
Because we serve a boring God.
Right, or a burdensome God, right? You're not going to be who you want to be.
Yeah.
That's not what this Christian life is about. It's about freedom and joy and love and acceptance and transformation too.
Yeah.
But, so I would say to people, God shows up in the life of everybody.
That's right.
Are you paying attention?
Are you looking?
Are you looking? Yeah. When you think it is, explore that more.
Yeah.
Was that God talking to me? Yeah, it probably was. Now, what was he trying to say?
Yeah.
Right. So it's taking that next step rather than shutting the door and saying, "Oh, I'm not going to go there." Go there.
Yeah. It's like that scenario. There. If I asked you the question, "How many red cars did you see today?" You're probably not going to remember. But if I asked you from here on out, come here the next week, show me how many red cars you've seen, you will be paying attention to every red car that's been passing by your life. Yeah.
So that's our episode on Was Jesus real? The answer to that is definitively, of course he was. He was a real historical figure. The question we want to ask you is, what is he to you? What is he to you? Have you really stopped to think who Jesus is to you? Have you stopped to ask him the question, Lord, who are you to me? That's my challenge to you. And if God is real to you or you're struggling with this, first of all, let me ask this. If you have a story of how you know Jesus is real, we would love to hear from you. Put it in the comments, send us an email. We would love to hear from you on what your story is of how you know God is real. Yeah. If you have questions about this or you're wondering if God is speaking to you, reach out to us. We'd love to answer those questions for you. But the answer to the question at the beginning of the episode is yes. Jesus is real. He was a real person. And the question you have to answer for yourself is, who is he to you? We'll see you next time on the Barely Believing podcast.